Hello again. I've missed you all. Great. So I don't want to talk that much. I will ask a few questions about civic innovation, and then I would love to open it up to the floor and have everyone participate. So first, I wanted to just start off by if everyone could just give a brief introduction. What hat are you wearing as you sit at this table? I think that would help everyone in terms of understanding the points that you're coming from.
Sure. My name is Robert Friedman. I'm with Mozilla, and our work you may be familiar with through Firefox, our browser, but as a nonprofit organization, we kind of see ourselves as the Greenpeace of the internet. We work to preserve the internet as a global public resource that's open and accessible to all. So really preserving its power as a force for democracy and civic participation. And locally, I focus on the education community. So I work with nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations, for-profits, schools, libraries, et cetera, that teach digital literacy to young people in Austin.
My name is Mike Kanin, and I publish the Austin Monitor, and I'm the president of the nonprofit that runs it. We sort of exist to reimagine and reinvigorate local journalism, and we're always looking to work with folks that help us do that.
Hi, again, Craig Watkins, professor here in the Moody College of Communication. And I guess the hat that I'm wearing for this particular panel is two. On the one, I'm a researcher, and I've been working closely with a number of different organizations, including, for example, the MacArthur Foundation, and kind of exploring young people's migration into the digital world and how that's transforming how they live, how they learn, but increasingly how they also participate in civic and political life. And I've actually begun to start flirting with the idea of being kind of a practitioner or a designer and sort of working with schools, educators, both here in Austin but around the country and in some cases around the world to sort of rethink what classrooms might look like and then what that means for creating new kinds of citizens.
Fantastic. So I'm going to start off with a loaded question, which we all kind of discussed going in. It's this term innovation. What does that mean? Speaking of terms that are ambiguous. So what does innovation mean to you?
Well, I mean, I kind of wish it didn't have such a negative, loaded connotation to it. It's perhaps overused, I think. But I would define it somewhat simply as sort of novel solutions to challenges that have persisted for a long time. So thinking about how sort of the new power structures can be applied to solve challenges that have been around forever. And perhaps creative solutions that the new power structures enable to new challenges that we face because of these new power structures. So I think it's both novel solutions to old problems and creative solutions to new problems.
I think that's a great definition, and I would add that from my world, I think it means survival. I think that as media has, you all are aware, as media has suffered over the last 2 decades, really, a lot of us have had to really think about how to do it a little bit better, maybe more than a little bit better, and that's placed us, I think, in thinking about things like nonprofit media outlets, which y'all I'm sure are familiar with the Texas Tribune. Those folks have done a great job, and but the Texas Tribune is not the only nonprofit out there. Monitor, for one. I think there was a list. A guy named Jake Batzel wrote a book about all this, and I think he had a list of like 30 of them out there. A lot of folks thinking about local journalism in new ways, and without that sort of innovation, I think we'd all be sort of subsidiaries of Annette.
I guess for me, it's in some ways very similar to what Robert suggested, right? It's this idea of being able to sort of imagine new possibilities, imagine new solutions, but I think increasingly, being in a position to sort of mobilize the resources to make that vision or to make those new possibilities tangible, to make them real, to make them material. And so, and I'm sure that's something we'll be talking more and more about is, what are those resources? How do we tap them? How do we make them more accessible? And how does that accelerate innovation across a number of different spheres and sectors?
Yeah, I think before we get into that discussion, it'd be interesting to frame a more contemporary. Where are we currently? What are the contemporary trends that make us really want to rethink civic innovation, rethink how we engage with it? What are the needs? And maybe then after we'll get into the resources. I would also love it for y'all to just go at a conversation too. So don't feel to go line by line.
you want to start with that?
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I think what's driving the conversations that we've had here today, the presentations that we've had here today, is so what's exciting about all of this, right? Is that we are living right in the midst of a lot of change and creativity. And it was mentioned earlier today, I think, I forget by which of our first two speakers, but they were basically talking about the ways, I think it was the Giving Tuesday campaign, and how that campaign, as it was originated, and what it has become today in its evolution around the world, are two entirely different things. And I think in some ways that's the story of the digital age. That's the story of the digital platforms that we're all familiar with, if it's Facebook, if it's Twitter. So one obvious example would be Twitter, right? And what I mean by that is we tend to sort of celebrate innovation on the design side, on the invention side, right? So Mark Zuckerberg with Facebook, the founders of Google, you name it. But I think what's equally interesting is the innovation that happens on the adoption side, right? And that is what people do with technologies once they get them in their hands and in their communities, and they sort of articulate them in ways that the creators and producers never could have imagined, right? So it's very likely, right, that the creators of YouTube would have never imagined that YouTube would become the kind of global phenomenon that it is today. For some people, it's a search engine, right? It's where they go to find information about the world. It's where they go to learn new things. For some people, right, it's a broadcasting channel or medium, right? It's a way in which they sort of express their views to the world and sort of mobilize community in that way. And so I think in some ways, right, this is sort of the story of innovation of our times, is that what makes this such a really interesting period, and I think a really energizing period, right, is that the possibilities really are endless, right? And we're seeing the ways in which people are beginning to adopt, and sort of reimagine how technologies can be deployed in all kinds of ways.
And yet I would note that, and this is a very specific thing, before the change in government in the city of Austin, we could regularly see, going back at least a decade, that voter participation was between 6 and 12% at the local level. And when we had our big, Lyft Uber, for lack of a better metaphor, election here in May, we had a 17% turnout, which was celebrated as a major victory. I would suggest that there's a lot of work to be done at the local level. I think you're totally dead on. I think that that watching people take things and use them in a way that was not necessarily intended is definitely what that's about. But I would challenge all you out there to grab your local community by the throat and sort of apply some of what Dr. Watkins is suggesting.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to some of that. I mean, the nature of communication has changed. So the engagement channels available to citizens have changed. And so I think one of the important trends shaping modern civic innovation is can we provide the sort of experiences that build the appropriate literacies to fully engage with those new channels. So I think literacy, obviously from my position, is a major space for innovation. How do we engage the public to use these tools in productive ways? But I also thought that the comments earlier about the town square are a big deal, and they're a big deal in a couple of different ways. Which is, one, I don't think Facebook killed the town square. I mean, shopping malls probably did, but that was. That was a privately owned space where people started to congregate that took over what might have been public space in the past. But even then, those public spaces were always fractured, whether it was church basements or private clubs or wherever. People are having civic dialogue in distributed places always. But I do think that the town square piece is a big deal because we do have a digital town square. It is the web. For right now, at this moment, if you want to publish something today and be heard and seen by people, and at least in the United States, you can do that. You still have the power to create your own website, web page, and publish your thoughts and exchange your ideas with others in an unmediated fashion. Now, there's access issues. It's not necessarily cheap. There's technology that gets in the way of doing that, but it's still right. But there is a future where that town square, the web, does not exist, and where the only channel is Facebook or Twitter, and those are mediated. So I think it's a healthy balance of mediated and unmediated town squares. And I think the innovation opportunity is, can we reinforce the web? Can we reinforce these unmediated spaces as an alternative to the mediated ones, which are also important?
But at the same time, and coming from the publishing world, the fact that everybody can publish is not necessarily a great thing. I am not going to I'm not going to shit all over the First Amendment, but I think that
That's good.
Good place to start.
Considering my job, but I do think that it's a problem for those of us who try to publish. The Monitor tries to be as straight ahead as possible. We try to be very neutral in what we do, and sometimes that doesn't get the attention that other stuff does. I think the simple solution there is media literacy, which of course is not a simple solution in any kind of way.
You're right.
But I think your point about open platform, there is no world in which should be limited by expression shouldn't be limited. It's just we have to get better about absorbing it and how we consume it.
Yeah.
So on that idea of an open platform, the opportunities are there. Also, the need to change for survival is also definitely a threat in there as well. Talk about from your experiences, from your work background and your perception, what is civic? What's possible? I mean, much of my presentation actually was kind of up in the air and maybe a bit more medical and not grounded, but like ground civic innovation for us. What does it actually look like?
You first, Michael.
Boy. The simple, there's so much that's possible. I mean, I think that one of the exciting things about being a publisher in 2016 is that everything's open to you because almost everything has failed. So you can do we can put together a small nonprofit media outlet and be relatively successful in Austin, Texas, and I think that is a lesson to anybody who wants to do what they want to try and do in the publishing world within that sort of framework that you should be responsible for what you're doing. The conversation we were just having. That's a very specific example. I think that thinking about the larger civic space, which is of course what you guys are after. Whether it's participation, as I think that's the key, and making sure that local government is more accessible. Local government, I think government in general is more accessible to folks. I think is definitely possible. And I think that there are very specific ways, and that we try to do. We maintain a boards and commissions database, so you can go and look and see who's appointed who, or whatever. Just very simple stuff like that. To the game nights that we do with Open Austin, where we try to make concepts like the city budget, which is about as much fun as you can imagine, into something that is accessible and actually fun. And I would encourage y'all to come and check out our happy hour. We've got that going on this afternoon. Small plug. Anyway, I'll stop talking.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think so. I've had the opportunity over the last few years to think a lot about this question, and I think the kinds of conversations that I've been involved in point to sort of two kind of key institutions. One would be our schools, and then the second one would be other public spaces like libraries, for example. Right, and thinking about those as sort of vital resources. And based on some of the research that I've done, right, resources that are absolutely central to some people, right? Because one of the things that's come up throughout the day, and it's come up here, we hear terms like media literacy, or we hear terms like the digital divide, and some other terms that we've heard, and these are all in some ways a reference to the kinds of disparities that still exist in the digital world. So even though more and more people are now online, even though mobile has sort of enhanced the number of people both in this country and around the world who can access technology, I think it's still important to keep in mind that not all forms of access are necessarily equal. And so what are the roles, the sort of intervening roles that institutions like schools and libraries can play in terms of trying to bridge what some might call either the participation gap, that is not so much that people are lacking access to technology, but perhaps lacking access to those skills and literacies, right, that really sort of enable them to become more dynamic, more robust kind of participants in the digital world. Some of my colleagues, talk about the civic opportunity gap, right, and that not all kids have access to the opportunities to realize their civic voices. And so what role can schools and libraries play in terms of facilitating those opportunities, expanding those opportunities, sort of bridging some of those disparities that are still so pronounced. And at some point, I guess, in this conversation, I can talk a little bit about some of the work that we've kind of prototyped in some schools around which we're trying to really address those questions around the participation gap, enhancing the quality of participation, the civic opportunity gap, empowering young people, right, to become more actively involved in their communities, and how technology, among other things, can be sort of a leveraging sort of asset to help make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, I want to double down on a lot of what you guys just said, just the places where civic innovation is most fertile perhaps today. We've hit on a couple of those, whether there's schools, libraries, or, local media publishers or local news journalism organizations. One of the thoughts I was having throughout the day as I was listening to all the speakers was really, what do we mean by civics? And I just was thinking about how government-oriented our definition of civics is. And I think that's because we live in a country where we're fortunate to be able to innovate in our own government, where private citizens, individuals, or groups can influence their government. I loved what you were saying about, though, the altering that definition a bit and talking more about the interaction between individuals and the community. And I think that's a piece of civics. I mean, you're a citizen, even if you're not in a democratic country, because you live in a civic society and you engage with other people in your community and your society. So in thinking about some of that stuff, I really, for me, I think the space, what's possible, is in ways in which we enhance the interaction between our community. And I think that's part of the literacy opportunity, is in stewarding better dialogues between community members and helping bring learning opportunities to young people that engage them with their community in rich ways. We're building that literacy and we're improving the potential. That was all pretty abstract, and one more abstract thought too, but we can get more concrete. I think we should maybe. The other abstract thought was a little bit about, a guy I really admire, Seymour Papert, and he was an educator, mathematician, who was really thinking about digital learning early on. And he had this term, it was machines to think with. So that computers were an opportunity to extend human consciousness. That all sounds kind of crazy, but what it really means is that you can use a machine to simulate an experience, to build empathy in a way with humans that you can't necessarily do in your isolated experience. So to double down on budget game night, one of the beautiful things about this civic app that was constructed openly, I watched the whole process, development process, through open channels, through Open Austin. It was done in a way that simulates the distribution of funds in a city and engages, and the future plans for it are really to engage young learners in that simulation. But that also provides data to the city, which creates a conversation, a two-way street between folks who are practicing being a citizen and folks who are actually doing this work in ways that are consequential and learning more about their constituents. So that was still maybe a little abstract, but I think the budget game is a cool thing to check out this afternoon. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, some of you may be familiar with it, but if you aren't, I'll recommend a paper by Henry Jenkins. He wrote this paper, I think, when he was at MIT with some colleagues of his. He's now at USC. But it's called, the lead title is Participatory Cultures. And in that paper, he and his colleagues sort of explore some very specific examples of what we mean by sort of 21st century or kind of new literacies or new media literacies. But there are a couple things that are important about that paper, right, is that I think they're very careful, and rightly so, very careful not to negate what we might consider more traditional or legacy literacies that were sort of born in the age of sort of print media culture versus those kind of new literacies, right, that are born in the age of sort of digital networked kind of media culture. And he argues, right, that it's not an either or proposition, right, that both of those kinds of skills and literacies are absolutely critical in terms of creating the kinds of civic innovation, the kind of civic agents that I think we're describing here today. And they list about 11 or 12 sort of literacies that sort of apply to this new concept. And then they give very concrete examples of how schools and other community organizations are trying to really create spaces for young people and others to practice these skills. But some of them, right, are the skills of multitasking, networking, transmedia, and collective intelligence. And if you go through, and it's about 11 or 12, but if you go through them, most of them actually aren't technology specific are really about a technology. They're social skills, they're skills about sort of negotiating with people, collaborating together, a kind of crowdsourcing, right, the energy, the expertise and intelligence that a group or an organization might have, and figuring out ways to sort of leverage that. So and we've heard this from earlier presentations today, but a lot of what I think is being communicated here is that this is not a technology-driven kind of solution, and rather it's about how do we create spaces and opportunities for people to use technology in smart ways, but sort of recognizing that the real skills aren't necessarily tech-specific, but are really more social, more cognitive, more cultural.
But I think we're going back to some of these fundamental core skills, civic skills in this new context, because they're new channels, and we have not, we're exploring and experimenting and learning in a totally new engagement space, right? There's a different way of interacting with each other, and we have to relearn some of, I think, the fundamental, modes of interaction between people in this new
how to
context.
have a conversation, is that?
Like how to have a conversation, how to tell who's being truthful and who's not. There's a lot of fundamental skills we're relearning in this new space.
And if I could real fast, I think for us that manifests itself, of course, in the comment section. And as much as I'd love to have a comment section on our paper, we just don't do it. And we have yet to figure out a way to make that possible in a way that is constructive, and constructive being the operative word. Anybody has ideas, please come see me.
And Robert, one of the skills that they talk about in that paper is the skills of negotiation, right? And what they mean by, there's a growing sort of advocacy, right, for diversity, right? Bringing different voices, different perspectives, different experiences to the table, with the recognition, right, that too can contribute to coming up with something innovative, right? As opposed to people, having the same perspective, same ideas, and what truly innovative or different can you get out of that? But what it means when you bring different people to the table, different perspectives, different voices, different visions, how do you negotiate, right, those differences, and how do you create a space and an opportunity and a process that really sort of helps facilitate that?
Yeah, crowdsourcing solutions isn't actually that simple.
Right.
Fantastic. I have just a few more questions, but I actually really just want to open it up. But so I want to start high level and then take this local. So what are the systemic challenges impeding civic innovation? So, what are the constraints that we're facing? Is it, lack of public spaces, or, needing to reinvest in these tools or skill sets? What do you see as the systemic challenges?
So there are many. So we made a reference to schools earlier. You could argue that in some ways, unfortunately, right, schools are a kind of a constraining factor here. And this is historical in nature, right, in terms of what is the role of schools, right? And oftentimes, increasingly in a sort of STEM-driven kind of world that we live in, a STEM sort of dominated sort of public discourse, the idea, right, is that school is its primary purpose, right, is to help kids get jobs in a sort of tech, sort of knowledge-driven economy. And certainly a case can be made for that. But there are also those who advocate, right, that should our schools not be designed to not only prepare people for the jobs of the future, but to prepare people for the sort of civic challenges of the future as well, right? And so that means not only creating good workers, right, which has always historically been problematic, but creating good citizens. And what does that mean to be a good citizen? And so I think in some ways, schools have been, unfortunately, right, one of the constraining factors, and one of the sort of ongoing debates that we've been having in the research network that I'm a part of, and certainly beyond, is how do we reimagine schools, right? And part of that reimagining schools is what is their role, what is their function, and how do they equip young people with a range of skills that allow them to be the sort of effective agents of change that we advocate for.
And I think that to some extent, I think, I would think of good journalism as a way to supplement that education. We have a program called Modern in the Classroom. We go up to a high school here, linear high school, and we use our content as curriculum, and we try to give those folks, we try to supplement the very standard and extend-focused education that is popular with civics and rhetoric, understanding that stuff. And I think that journalists can play a role in it. I think that you mentioned libraries. I think libraries are, those civic spaces are just so necessary, and I think it's a great point.
Yeah, both the Gates Foundation, Knights Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, and certainly others as well, have seriously invested in this question, right? What the future of libraries, right? What should they look like?
Yeah.
What role should they play? And there's a recognition, right, that this is a very important resource for a lot of people. And so, to turn them into labs where innovation can happen, civic innovation, education innovation, social innovation. I mean, that's a really interesting conversation that a lot of communities are beginning to have.
And I guess I think that just thinking a little bit about where this conversation has gone, and some of the themes that we have shared, it's really been, where is civic innovation sort of critical right now, and it's in the space where we help citizens navigate and understand information through education, through effective journalism, through public spaces. So I think that's a common theme that we were kind of touching on. And so I think, adding to, whether or not those institutions are healthy and strong is also an issue of, I think mobility, whether people are able to even get to where they need to be, because some of these institutions have been gutted or don't exist in communities anymore. Mobility is a big challenge. If you want to have a town hall, where do you have it? If you want to help a community, where are you having your meetings? Do they have the facilities? Whatever. I mean, this sounds kind of minor, but the way in which people are able to move matters, because a lot of the folks with the resources don't necessarily reside in the spaces and places where people need those resources. I was going to take a little bit of a left turn maybe too, and say that there's a real tech challenge, the real tech constraint to civic innovators who really want to create a polished and a product that is going to compete with a Facebook or a Twitter for attention, for engagement. Whether it's I think UX was brought up as a major issue earlier, and I want to double down on that one and say, it's hard to build a really quality experience on the web, for example, because that open source technology is complex like every other open source technology. And then it's harder still to do it on platforms that are closed and require immense expertise to build on. So folks who actually want to build this tech are challenged to make that civic experience as compelling as their competitors. That's a major constraint too. A little bit of a different flavor than I think we've hit on so far, but something to consider that's not easy, and it's not easy to address.
Right. Well, hopefully taking this into a more an easier place. Austin. What are the constraints with Austin? Challenges with Austin? What can we do in this room? Hyper-local to facilitate this?
Well, I think this it goes back to something that I said and something that Dr. Watkins said. I think access is a huge thing. Access to government, access to the tools with which to access government, access to the internet. I mean, you just don't. It's not. We know that if last year we were at the top of this. I'm sure many of you know this economic disparity list. We were the most last year economically segregated city in the country. I think that bears out across the civic sphere. If you look historically, at least again over the last 20 years, Austin government has been elected by and run by people in 2 zip codes. And that I think was an enormous challenge and one that we're still trying to get over. I can talk all day about 10-1, but I won't. Come drink with me. But I think it also goes back to that part, and that's part of the participation question. We have early voting here. We have the Travis County tax assessor collector Bruce Elfman deserves applause. That guy works his butt off. He registered 90% of this county for this particular election. Wow. And I will bet you that not more than 20% of them get all the way down the ballot. And that's a challenge for me and for all of you. I have to, in my self-appointed role, I have to tell you about what's going on in local civics, but then you got to read it and you got to go out and vote about it. And that's something that we're still trying to work with. And again, I'm open to all comments.
Yeah, it's Austin's an interesting case study, right, for a number of the things that are being discussed here today. I think most people are aware of the sort of general narrative about Austin, right, that it's a growing city, it's attracting, young talent. If you think about the sort of signature events that happened here, South by Southwest, you've got large music festivals. Taylor Swift is performing here this weekend. The weekend backed out, but Usher, they got him to come in under very short notice, by the way. But the point being, right, is that Austin is what Richard Florida termed a few years ago one of those sort of creative cities, right? And the city has been very actively involved in sort of branding itself as that, in addition to being the live music capital of the world. But it's this idea, right, that it's also a magnet for the creative class. And so this new research project that I've started a couple of years ago called Doing Innovation, one of the questions that we're asking about creative cities like Austin, innovation hubs, innovation economies like Austin, is by virtue of the things that make them successful, do they also become problematic insofar as these cities become highly segregated in terms of class, in terms of race, in terms of education? And that's certainly the case, right? And we see it in Silicon Valley, we see it in other sort of innovation hubs. And so in that respect, I think the challenges that Austin will face, right, are the challenges that society is facing, certainly that the tech sector is facing, and that is how do you become more inclusive, how do you become more diverse, how do you really begin to create a space and an opportunity in which more people can participate in the kinds of innovations that are happening. And so it's a conversation that's happening kind of on the edges of Austin, but I think needs to become increasingly central to how we reimagine the city moving forward. But more importantly, how do we also implement, right, ideas and strategies and interventions that begin to address, right, the sort of growing problem where Austin's core is becoming wider, more highly educated, more economically affluent, and its margins and edges are becoming browner, less educated, less economically affluent, and it creates some real challenges and some real issues.
Yeah, I mean, I'm new. I just moved here 3.5 months ago, and so I can give you that perspective, which I think I'm that person. I came to Austin, and someone was there before me. Well, maybe not, because apparently I live in Mueller of all places, which apparently was the airport. And that's interesting. I'll tell you, I came to Austin, and I moved into a convenient place to live that worked for my needs and that was in my price point, whatever. And it was just that simple, right? But there's a history there. And in some parts of Austin, in East Austin, which I'm learning through conversations with folks, the parts of Austin, that I ride down on Chicon and 12, I'm probably not saying that right yet, but, in 12th Street and all the way down, right, to the river, those were different places 10 years ago, completely different places. And so when we're talking about civic engagement and the future of civic engagement, and we're talking about Austin, hyperlocal, and we define it only as our relationship to city government, well, what does that mean for all those folks who were part of that space and are now on the other side of a boundary line and maybe no longer be relevant in that conversation in a way that's even more dramatic than before? And so that's why I think that civic piece, just thinking about our relationship to city government can be problematic, and I think really thinking about our relationship to each other is an important part of civics. And so, especially when those people were here and part of that conversation not 2 years ago.
I think it's an excellent point, and one that I think spewing forth with voter statistics like I just did totally disregards. I point out that this weekend, I think that it was there's this long, I'm sure you guys are familiar with the Jump-A-Lin saga and the Blue Cat Cafe that went in after Jump-A-Lin. And this weekend, I think they got graffitied and their doors, the locks glued shut and everything. That, of course, is indicative of a much larger problem. The folks, if you want to boil it down, feeling left out and not quite knowing how to make themselves more included. That is a much larger issue. I think it's worth there.
Yeah, I think you made reference to it a few times throughout your talk, and I think we've heard about it earlier today as well. So we understand the concept of human capital, right? Knowledge, that stuff that's in your brain and how important that is. But social capital is also really important, right, too, in terms of your connections and your ties, the wealth of the people that you're connected to, and how that extends the kinds of resources that you might be available or have available to you. And so as I think about Austin and the challenges that are happening here, which again I think are emblematic of challenges that are happening kind of globally, and certainly here in this country, is how do we begin to sort of think about social capital, and how do we create opportunities for communities that find themselves on the margins to sort of grow and cultivate the kinds of social capital that enhance their civic voice, their participation in what happens in their communities, and the degree to which they can have greater influence.
I think that's a really important point. I would also say the libraries, like libraries have such an interesting role that they can play as a convener across different sectors, across different neighborhoods and communities. And so New York City Public Library recently held a digital equity convening that I was a part of. And it was, we're behind as a city in terms of the digital equity divide. And, the library was the one that convening all of these practitioners, government officials. And so there's a role to play for conventional civics organizations as well. I do want to open the floor for questions. Hello.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Michael again. So I was wondering, to get to some of the nitty-gritty, if y'all could talk a little bit about data schemas, and specifically the examples. New York and San Francisco have done a good job, I think, of opening up public data APIs. Do y'all think that those are models that can be replicated in a city like, just to pick one out of the hat, San Antonio, or do you think that those two cities are kind of sui generis and probably aren't good models on which to base the building of those kinds of bridges between government and the private sector, the nonprofit philanthropic sector?
So I don't intimately know those two examples so well, so if someone else in the audience does, I'm totally happy to hear from that. I will say, though, that New York City and San Francisco are very big examples of a huge agency putting a lot of resources together to get information localized, and that is not a replicable thing across the country. And so there are Socrata, there are organizations and companies that make this a little bit more plug and play in terms of that. I will say open data is also just not the answer if there's not institutions that can actually use use the data. And it's about people. I would say.
That's a great point. Yeah.
But at the same time, I think it's the responsibility. Again, my bias with journalism, but I think it's responsibility of a local journalistic outfit to pick up on that stuff. I mean, Open Austin here has been great about turning up some of the data. We were actually just having a conversation out there in the hall about how the city council votes aren't recorded in a way that is exportable. Like, I can't just grab an RSS feed and say this is what happened. I think that whether or not, and like you, Kate, I'm not familiar with the New York and San Francisco models, but I don't see why there isn't a reason to aspire to get as much out there in the open as possible, and to figure out the receptacles. I mean, and I think in a city like Austin, there's plenty of interest in using that data.
Hi. One thing that seems to come up in the same breath as civic tech stuff is smart cities with big data, predictive analytics, multivariate analysis. And I'm wondering if you perceive that as a complement to civic tech or a threat to general civic participation, and what that might mean for folks downstream.
Well, I mean, I think the community pushback I've seen for those kinds of initiatives have been around, what is this data being used for? And I think this is generally somewhat aligned with the direction that you were going in saying that the data itself is not just collecting the data or making the data open, maybe not enough. What are the compelling use cases? What are the questions that we're asking that this data will help us answer? I think those are important pieces of the puzzle. But I don't know. I have a feeling you're speaking to the way in which that data is being shared as well. Whether or not that smart city data is open and accessible to the public, or whether it's hidden behind private channels.
Go ahead.
Probably to clarify, I'm thinking is, why do I need to go to a neighborhood meeting if the city already knows where the potholes are, or if there's the assumption that the city knows where the potholes are, but they're just not doing anything about them? That if you're one step ahead of the citizens in terms of analyzing the whatever jurisdiction you're doing, or issues of surveillance and privacy and things like that as well. I was mostly just trying to be provocative by asking the question then too.
Yeah.
I mean, there is, right? I mean, this has really been an interesting development over at least the last 2 or 3 years that I'm aware of, and I'm sure it's been happening even before then. But there's a growing recognition, right, that we hear a lot about this era of big data, and there's a lot of sort of celebration of that and all of the possibilities. But we're also beginning to hear about the sort of the darker side of big data, right, and how just the massive sort of surveillance, the massive collection of everything that we do, right, with our smartphones, for example, the ability to track us, the ability to know what we're searching for, who we're communicating with, that there are privacy issues there. And we're also beginning to recognize that there are issues around sort of social and economic and class inequality around the ways in which big data are being misused, right? Not necessarily intentionally, but
Yep.
the sort of unintended consequences of big data in terms of its potential effects on people's employment prospects, their access to health, the ways in which communities are being surveilled and policed. So I think we're in an interesting moment, right, where we're beginning to sort of raise the specter of doubt and concern and scrutiny about the ways in which big data can be misapplied or applied in ways that reproduce these kinds of inequities that we're so troubled by.
Well, actually, and I started thinking about everything you were just saying and sort of the nature of the conversation you're actually asking. I actually think this is exciting, right? We're kind of wasting our time talking about potholes. Can we get that out of the way? And what kind of conversation can we have about streets if we knew where all the potholes were? If we can map those and look at trends that those reveal. So I think there's in channeling Prepared again, like there's an opportunity to enhance our consciousness about a city with that kind of a data, which changes the nature of the conversation. But there's a responsibility towards literacy. Everything I just said was sort of super abstract and meta. So how do you interpret the visualizations? How do you lead a discussion with the community around that? Mm-hmm. And does the community feel engaged in that discussion? Those are all more complex issues, but I don't think it eliminates the opportunity for a town square, the opportunity for conversation, if we now know where all the potholes are.
Yeah, I would agree with that last sentiment, and I'll be a smart ass and say that I don't think anything is ever going to eliminate the need for a community meeting in the city of Austin.
Perfect. I want to go back hyper-local. So I have followed civic education for the better part of 20 years, civic tech long enough to be both disappointed but still very hopeful. And the question about where civic innovation happens, my answer definitely would have turned to reimagined libraries that we've seen through some of the foundations you pointed to, but also to Civic Hall. And I think that this kind of collaboration with different partners from different sectors is really, really important. So my question for you all here in Austin is two sides of that coin. Like, what is your most lucrative partnership? Like, who have you worked with most successfully? And then what's the partnership that you need to reach some of these spaces that we want to get to create really vibrant opportunities for folks to participate in the civic space that aren't always invited?
It's a really good question. Yeah. So here's one attempt to try to answer it. So I'm primarily connected to the University of Texas. So that's my primary institution. And so partnerships, relationships, resources, the things that I do are in some ways sort of catalyzed by that relationship. But I think myself and the university more broadly, right? And this isn't unique to the University of Texas, but there's an increasing sort of recognition of how we can become more actively and productively involved in the community and the world around us. And so I'm increasingly interested in figuring out ways in which I can partner with institutions, communities, organizations, and efforts that aren't university-based or university-centric for a variety of reasons, right? In terms of the benefits that we as a university would gain as a result of those partnerships, sort of recognizing, right, that the barriers between what happens in a space like this and just across I-35, right, where communities that historically have been sort of locked out of the kinds of things that happen here and the conversations, the resources, the activities. And so I think there are a number of people, right, who are sort of invested in how do we begin to build that bridge that allows the things that happen here to be more connected to the community, and likewise for the community to be more connected and to inform and drive, what happens here in the university.
If you're talking literally lucrative, if you're talking about dollars, and I do want to say this because I think it's important. For us, our best, our most lucrative partnership is with our subscribers. Those are the folks that support what we do, sort of unconditionally month to month, and that's a model that is always sort of raises questions with me, which is the reason I want to talk about it, because we have subscribers, that means that some folks can't get access to our site, and is that is that where we want to be? I don't know. I struggle with that. Lucrative in terms of helping us get out into the community. I'll go ahead and not just because you guys are in the room, but the Open Austin partnership has been great. And what that's allowed us to do is it allowed us to build the Budget Game Night app. It's allowed us to think about using technology in new ways, very simple new ways, to engage the folks in the community through games. And I think that down the line will probably lead to more of the other sort of lucre stuff, which is the subscribers.
Yeah, you guys are asking really good questions that require like thinking, and that's good. And for me, the biggest challenge in answering this question is the multiple modes of engagement I've had in doing this work. Whether it's globally with Mozilla, where MacArthur Foundation has been a great asset for the work that we've done. Whether it was locally in Chicago with their branch of CFA, Shy Hack Nights is what they call themselves. And then, thinking about locally what I'm doing here in Austin, where like Google Fiber has been such a great collaborator in the work. But in one of the hats that I wear, one of the angles that I take in my work, it's connecting organizations and creating partnerships. And in that area, what I found lucrative and successful is the marriage between small community-based organizations that are hyper-local in their neighborhoods and understand their target population exceedingly well, and larger city agencies like the libraries or the parks. And when we've been able to pair those two organizations together effectively, what we've had is both an engine for innovation, which is the community-based organization that is doing new and exciting things all the time. They really are. And a channel for distribution where the library or the park can take lessons learned, generalize them a little bit, and push them out to partners around the city. There's been a few cases like that, happy to talk about them, that have been really exciting. And, and I think there's a model there, right? There's a user-centered design piece here where the small partner understands the end user and co-creates things with them. But then there's also the scalability piece, which is who's going to help take this solution and make it, document it and distribute it and make it available to other people. But sometimes one institution can't do all of that. It's too much of a spread. So that's been a lucrative channel, I think.